The Trans-Saharan slave trade, lasting nearly 2 millennia, remains one of history's most overlooked atrocities in history. While the transatlantic slave trade has been widely recognized for its brutality and scale, the Trans-Saharan slave trade predates it by thousands of years and was equally devastating. Over 10 million Africans were captured, enslaved, and transported across the harsh and unforgiving Sahara Desert, many never to be seen again. This trade, driven by the demand for labor, concubinage, and economic expansion, left a profound and lasting impact on African societies, economies, and cultures. The roots of the Trans-Saharan slave trade can be traced back to the 3rd millennium BC, during the reign of King Sneferu, the first pharaoh of Egypt's 4th dynasty. Ancient Egyptian expeditions ventured beyond the 4th cataract of the Nile into what is now modern Sudan. These expeditions were not merely exploratory. They were military campaigns aimed at capturing prisoners of war. These captives, primarily Nubians, were enslaved and transported north to Egypt. The Nubians, who inhabited the region of modern-day Sudan, were frequently targeted due to their proximity, located directly to the south of Egypt, along the Nile River, making it a neighboring region. This geographical closeness and the wealth of resources in their lands made Nubia an accessible target for Egyptian military campaigns, raids, and expeditions aimed at capturing slaves, as well as for trade and resource exploitation. Enslaved Nubians became an integral part of Egyptian society, serving as laborers in agriculture, construction, and domestic roles. Female slaves were also used as concubines. They were instrumental in building Egypt's monumental structures, including the pyramids, temples, and tombs. Female slaves were often used as concubines or attendants in royal households, while others were sacrificed for religious rituals. This practice of raiding neighboring regions for slaves was not unique to Egypt alone. Across the ancient Nile Valley and surrounding areas, conquest and enslavement were common. These early practices laid the foundation for the Trans-Saharan slave trade, which would expand significantly in later centuries. The Garamantes, a Berber-speaking people who thrived in the central Sahara, were among the earliest civilizations to exploit trans-Saharan slave labor. Living in an arid and inhospitable environment, the Garamantes relied heavily on enslaved individuals from sub-Saharan Africa to sustain their society. One of their most notable achievements was the construction of the phoaroah, an advanced system of underground irrigation channels that allowed them to cultivate crops in the desert. These channels, essential for their survival, were built and maintained by enslaved laborers. The Garamantes also enslaved cave-dwelling Ethiopians, whom they referred to as the troglodytae. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, the Garamantes pursued these people with chariots, capturing them to serve as laborers. The Garamantes' dependence on enslaved populations positioned them as an early link in the trans-Saharan trade network. While their primary focus was on sustaining their communities, they likely participated in the exchange of goods and slaves with neighboring regions, laying the groundwork for the larger trans-Saharan trade systems that would emerge in later centuries. The trans-Saharan slave trade gained new momentum during the early Roman Empire. The city of Leptis Magna, located in modern-day Al-Qums, Libya, became a hub for the trade of slaves from the Bantu in the African interior. By the 5th century, Roman Carthage was actively engaged in trading black slaves brought across the Sahara. The empire imposed a customs tax on the trade of slaves. These slaves, valued for their exotic appearance, were primarily used as household servants in the Mediterranean region. The demand for slaves during this period was immense. Some historians suggest that the scale of the trans-Saharan slave trade during the Roman Empire may have been higher than in medieval times, driven by the empire's insatiable need for labor. However, the trade remained relatively limited in antiquity, as large-scale transportation across the Sahara only became feasible with the introduction of camels by Arabs and Berbers in later centuries. After the Arabs' conquest of North Africa in the early 7th and 8th centuries, the trade surged and expanded. Arabs, Berbers, and other groups ventured into sub-Saharan Africa, driven by the demand for slaves in the Eastern Arab nations and Constantinople. The enslaved populations, referred to as Sudan, meaning black, were acquired through violent raids by the Arabs and forced to march across the Sahara, where they would be sold. As a result of this, major slave markets emerged in cities such as Cairo, Tripoli, and Algiers, where slaves were sold in public spaces like souks. The trade was brutal and dehumanizing. Captives were treated as chattel, personal property to be bought and sold. Aside from raiding, slaves were also obtained through trade with local African rulers. Many black kings and chiefs became active participants and intermediaries in the Trans-Saharan slave trade, capturing individuals from neighboring villages or regions and selling them to Arab and Berber merchants. This practice was often driven by the promise of wealth and goods in exchange for human lives, creating a system where local rulers actively participated in the perpetuation of the trade. Some African groups raided their neighbors to capture slaves for sale, and local inhabitants competed with each other in the number of slaves they owned. Slaves were also gifted as a gesture of hospitality. Muslim merchants also lured children with dates to kidnap and enslave them. A Berber explorer, Ibn Battuta, in 1353, documented a caravan carrying 600 black female slaves to Morocco for domestic service and concubinage. His accounts highlight the scale and organization of the trade during the medieval period. The Trans-Saharan slave trade relied on a network of established trade routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa and beyond. These routes included the Tripoli-Gadames-Gat-Hoggar-Gao route, linking Libya to Nigeria, the Tripoli-Fezzan-Bornu route, connecting Libya to Chad, Niger, and Cameroon, the East-West route, which connected Egypt to Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. Passage through the Sahara was dangerous. Nomadic groups like the Tuareg facilitated the trade, serving as guides, guards, and camel drivers. Oases such as Aljila, Gadames, and Kufra in Libya were critical way stations for caravans. Despite their expertise, the journey was fraught with danger. Entire caravans sometimes disappeared, and many captives perished from dehydration, starvation, or exposure. Explorer Gustav Nachtigal reported finding human bones at dried-up desert springs, estimating that for every slave who reached the market, 3 or 4 had died during the journey. The British consul in Tripoli noted in 1858 that over 66% of the value of goods transported across the Sahara consisted of slaves. Enslaved individuals were assigned diverse roles depending on their destination. The conditions were often brutal. Tens of thousands of black slaves toiled in copper mines in Upper Egypt or on sugar plantations in Morocco, and others worked in the salt mines of Basra under grueling conditions, leading to the Zanj Rebellion during the 1800s. The Zanj Rebellion became a significant and prolonged uprising of enslaved East Africans, who were known as the Zanj, against the Abbasid Caliphate in southern Iraq. This revolt became one of the largest and most destructive slave uprisings in history and was fueled by the harsh conditions and systemic exploitation faced by the Zanj, who were primarily employed in grueling agricultural labor. Islamic law strictly prohibited the enslavement of Muslims, but this was often ignored. The curse of Ham was frequently cited to justify the enslavement of black Africans, even those who had converted to Islam. By the late 16th century, the trans-Saharan slave trade began to decline as European powers shifted their focus to the transatlantic slave trade. However, the trans-Saharan trade persisted into the 19th and early 20th centuries. In 1911, Adolf Vischer reported that slave trafficking continued along the Benghazi-Wadai route. The trade left a lasting impact on African societies. It disrupted communities, depopulated regions, and entrenched systems of exploitation. The legacy of the trans-Saharan slave trade is still felt today, shaping perceptions of race, identity, and history across Africa and the Mediterranean world. The trans-Saharan slave trade was a vast and enduring system of human exploitation that spanned nearly 2 millennia. It facilitated the forced movement of millions of Africans across the Sahara Desert, leaving a profound and lasting impact on the societies it touched. While often overshadowed by the transatlantic slave trade, the trans-Saharan trade deserves recognition as a critical chapter in the history of slavery. Its story is a reminder of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and resilience. A history that must be remembered, studied, and understood to ensure that its lessons are never forgotten.